Okay, hello. This is chapter 16, The South and the Slavery Controversy, 1793 to 1860. This is the culture and almost like how slavery became the way it is at that time because it kind of developed. It didn't just so happen that there was this desperate need for the economy to grow in such a way. Okay, so first you have the Cotton Kingdom, right? And tobacco was first, but then eventually switched to cotton. That became the Southern's main need. Um, it was tobacco, then and rice and sugar. Then later, cotton made more money, and the people shipped the cotton, and they also made money too. The people up north shipped the cotton and also made, riches and profits. The north and the south were also, basically using slavery, not just the south itself. And the South produced more than half of the world's cotton supply. So this was a big deal. This wasn't a small piece. This was a lot. And 75% of the precious supply of fiber came from the white carpeted acres of the South. Okay, Cotton was a powerful monarch indeed, Cotton King. Um, so first they had an aristocracy, something like a class system where the rich were at the top, and this plantation owner would have like a mansion basically in the middle of this whole plantation of cotton, big house, and they would have lots of money. And it was very undemocratic. It hampered tax support education because the rich planters could send their children to private institutions, so they didn't need public education. So they didn't need or feel the need to support it. So that left other white people uneducated. Okay, so it was like a feudal society that didn't change. Just like in Europe, it was medieval, and it was still medieval back in the South, where there was like this order from top to bottom. High class was in charge, and there was so many people who were slaves in the bottom of it all. The slaves of the slave system. There was so much plantation going on. They basically it was called land butchery. All the land was pretty much cleared just to make way for cotton. As the land were thin, many small farmers sold their holdings to more prosperous neighbors and went north and west. So, of course, there were some small farmers, right? But the plantation owners ended up buying them out to use their own land. Okay, so the slaves represented a heavy investment of capital, 1,200 each. So this is very expensive. Slaves are, in a way, very expensive. And if they get injured, if they ran away, they would really make sure that they wouldn't waste money by taking good care of them and being strict with them so they wouldn't go. And the fault of this cotton kingdom in the South was it was a one crop economy, and that was bad, meaning that eventually, if they were to ever have a different market or the cotton market goes down, it would it wouldn't be successful because there would be no alternative crop to make money from. Okay, so and where would they borrow money from to start a business in cotton? They would borrow money from the northern middlemen, bankers, and agents and shippers. So in a sense, the Southerners were they owed them money. Okay, the Cotton Kingdom also repelled large-scale European immigration, which added so richly to the manpower and wealth of the North. So people from Germany, Irish, very rarely would go to the South. They would mostly move to the North, and and in a way, these immigrants couldn't be considered for hire in the South because they could just get a slave to do the work for free, right? If they just buy them. So that's why they didn't have a different kind of a mixture of culture. They didn't have a mixed European blood there. Okay, so the white majority, 1,733 families in 1850 owned 100 or more slaves. Such an accurate number. So they owned 100 more, while everyone else, 345,000 families, they were the ones that only represented, that they told it to in 1850, some 345,000 families representing about 1,725,000 white persons. Over two-thirds of the families were 250,000, 268. So basically, this was a very high pyramid. It's very hard to become this family, make a lot of money. And if you own a lot of slaves, you can make a lot of money. The smaller slave owners did not own a majority of slaves, but they made up a majority of the masters. And they lived in the modest farmhouses sweated beside the bondsmen. So the small farmers, they were still working with the slaves. So there's in the top, you have the plantation owner, and then after that, the small farmers. Okay, remember, to the plantation owner, there's 1733 of them, 100 or more, they owned that many slaves. And then below that, small farmers or regular 6,000, and then 2920, and it goes down like this. So in the beginning, it was just really these places were just small cotton production, 1820. And then in 1860, a lot. They realized it was making a lot of money. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, even parts of Arkansas and Louisiana. You notice these three states are like right near each other. So that's where they were making a lot of money. So who were these other white people who wanted to be planters? They were the redneck farmers, that's which they call them. And this least prosperous white people were like, in a way, They called them some racial slurs like poor white trash, hillbillies, crackers. Why are they calling hillbillies? Because they live in the hill, because all the best land was taken by the plantation owners. These are whites without slaves. So they were really poor in that sense. Poor whites, there was mountain whites in West Virginia, northern Georgia, Alabama. They also had their own speech. They hated both the haughty planters. A rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, right? They were very poor. They were used in the war, and the rich people didn't fight, the southern rich people. Now, there are also some free blacks. And you call it the free blacks, southern free blacks, about 250,000. They were in the upper South, right, where they were closer to the north. So there was a free black population. Now, there's some mulattoes who were kind of like mixed, meaning black and white blood. That's because the white planter would take on a black mistress. These mulattoes would also be kind of free, but they would be moving mostly in New Orleans, away from the strict slavery places. New Orleans was a place of, mixed people. And these free blacks were kind of like a third race because they weren't really slaves. They weren't really free. They were like in the middle. They couldn't vote. They were barred from public schools. Okay. Northern blacks were especially hated by the pick and shovel Irish immigrants because the Irish didn't like to compete with them at the jobs, so the Irish didn't like them as well. Because Irish also looked for jobs because they were immigrants. Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist. Now we're going to see this word a lot, abolitionist. The goal for an abolitionist is their momentum or a movement to abolish slavery, and Frederick Douglass was a powerful force for that. So this is plantation slavery. Legal importation of African slaves into America ended in 1808. Slavery didn't end, just the transportation of it, the importation of it from Africa ended. But there were still already slaves in America, and they were already reproducing, so there were already slaves coming in. So you got some pictures here, how they would have them caught like this, and they chained them up. That's how they were treated. They put this around their neck so they could hear them. There's bells here. They try to escape. Slaves were investment, so they would try to not make them like fix a hole in the roof, because if they fall, they would die, and that would be a waste of money. So that's how they treat them, not because of their precious human beings, but because of the money they can make. Okay, so they were breeding a lot of slaves in all of this. Okay? They had slave auctions, and then the children would be separated. Okay, families would be separated like this, and the life of a slave was very bad. We all know that a lot of slaves were, especially in harsh conditions, from morning dusk till dawn. There's a white overseer, a guy in the back of them, whipping them to make sure that they keep working. Slaves were forbidden to testify in court, so they couldn't fight for their rights. They would be flogged, and if you really, really disobeyed, if a slave really disobeyed, there's these guys called breakers, and they would really torment them to never disobey their masters again. So there's a line called the Black Belt. Like imagine a line going through South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. This is where is the Cotton Kingdom, where they had slaves. Distinctive African American slave culture, forced separations of spouses, parents, and children. So, what was their family life like? Two-parent households, just like anyone else. They had to adopt a surname, a last name, but they had to get it from their masters. So they couldn't get their own last name that they wanted. They had to they had culture not to they avoided marrying their cousin. Israelites in Egypt. So one of the most haunting spirituals implored. Now, slaves were very familiar with Christianity because of the Israelites were also slaves of Egypt, so they felt like they could sympathize together, right? So a lot of them sang songs related to that. A burdens of bondage. They were not allowed to be educated. They were educated and they could read and write, and they could write letters for their freedom, or they could read the signs to know where the north is and get some help. Okay, they're not supposed to. They weren't motivated to do their work. So if they were like very unmotivated, they would get in trouble for it. Now, who would be motivated to be a slave? So that's why they never did so much of their best. Sometimes they would even poison their master's food and try to get them sick. A lot of slave runaways. They tried to run away, but it wasn't easy. Okay, now let's take a think about this early abolition. So there was first of all, the Quakers had a little abolition movement. Okay, they formed the American Colonization Society. Okay, capital in Monrovia. Okay, they wanted to help slaves out. So what this colonization society did is they put people in Liberia. Okay, and then they returned the slaves, in a sense, back into Africa. I guess that's the best way to send them to freedom than have them to be suffering in America. Of course, the best thing is to just free them in America, but they tried to do something as to just put them back in Africa. So there was a little kind of help they're trying to get by the American Colonization Society, which is founded by Quakers. Virtually all Southern slaves were no longer Africans, but native-born African Americans with their own distinctive history and culture. So you can't really bring an African American slave into Africa. He's going to not live well if he doesn't know the language anymore. So it would be better to free him in America. Okay. Now there's many preachers like Dwight Field, Charles Granson Finney, who were telling them slavery is wrong, it's a sin. So people up north were already part of this awakening. a lot of preachers, like, and women preachers, Beecher Stowe, Catherine Beecher, Henry Ward Beechers, all preaching against this. Even the daughters of the preachers were already creating a momentum of this abolition movement. There's even radical abolition, like William Lloyd Garrison, who was always putting in the his newspaper, he's saying demanding justice, getting everyone to have awareness about how it's such a big crime for slavery. William Lloyd Garrison formed the American Anti-Slavery Society here. Okay. Also, David Walker is a big name too. He said, "Fight for your slavery." He was also writing that in that magazine, like "Slaves Fight." Okay. Sojourner Truth, fighting for Black emancipation. Martin Delany, Frederick Douglass, all of these, especially Frederick Douglass was a very smart man. He had an idea he knew that the slaves had to be freed politically, the law with law support and government support. Okay, so there were the political parties that would help them: the Liberty Party, the Free Soil Party, and then the Republican Party. The abolitionists supported these parties to help free all the slaves. This picture of Frederick Douglass. Now, how did the South react? Of course, they were even becoming more strict when the abolitionists were growing in numbers and movement, and they had more stricter codes. Then Nat Turner's rebellion. So they tried to rebel, but it failed. Okay, and also they even tried to look for William Lloyd Garrison, and the Southerners tried to look for him because he was writing bad things about them, right? Nullification, peculiar institution. So they said, we're not going to follow any of the laws being against our slavery. And they try to back themselves up with the Bible and Aristotle to say that this is a necessary thing in life. But of course, it wasn't. So really, the Southerners were greedy for their money. The blacks mostly toiled in the fresh air and sunlight, not in dark and stuffy factories. And every time they would try to discuss slavery, there's this gag resolution, right? If they talk about something more too long, then they just say cannot. Okay, so the abolitionists had a big impact. They were able to get people to fight for the slaves. Southern planters owed northern bankers and other creditors $300 million. Okay, but of course there was always like people trying to look for. Southerners went to the north to look for those who were trying to go against their slave system. All right. Okay, so that's it. Okay, so today is Manifest Destiny, Chapter 17. Chapter 17, Manifest Destiny. Now, this is a very important chapter because this is where America expands, but at the same time, they will debate whether they can balance out free state and slave states. Now, remember, there's been a competition between balancing these powers out, and we know the South wants to expand slavery, and the North wants to free slavery, and of course, we call this a sectional balance here. So it's all about how much expanding we can do. Section 1, the accession of Tyler II. Now, unfortunately, William Henry Harrison, who was the president, is assassinated, or he gets killed, actually. But some say he could have been assassinated, but really, the vice president has to just take over from that point on and just changes everything. Henry Harrison was only there for a very short while, and John Tyler was more of a Democrat than a Whig. And some people believe that, hey, he would, he's against the bank, he's against internal improvement. And so he seems like he's a Democrat at heart, and that's what people were saying about that. Okay, remember, the Whig Party is pro-bank, pro-internal improvements, while the Democrat Party is against those things. They support private banks instead of the main bank, and they're not for internal improvements because internal improvements mean building roads because some money will go into from some particular states, while other states will be left behind and not getting those ones. So we have Tyler vetoing the bank. He is against it. And so what's going to happen with this so-called fake Whig, eventually he's going to have to try to bend. So even the tariff bill. Now remember, the Whigs prefer tariff bill to protect the industries, but he would be against it. But then he reluctantly signs it in 1842, a tariff bill, signed into law. Okay. Now America and Britain are now having some trouble with each other. They are not such in good terms. So what happens is they're starting to eventually slowly become separated from these, and not only just psychologically separating in their relationship. In newspapers are writing bad about each other and all that stuff, and they will have conflict in Canada, even in Maine. So they're having a Maine boundary dispute right here, and the goal was England or Britain wanted to build a road that will be connected from Halifax to Quebec. Now Quebec is the first. Quebec is the first colony, and so that becomes like the main city. Now Halifax is kind of like the east coast of Canada, so you have to go through Maine actually
you eventually got to touch Maine or get around Maine. And so basically they had this there was this disputable border. They didn't know what the border was. So it looked like this. Here's Quebec, and then here's Halifax. They wanted to build a road here, but no one knew if this was British land or American land. No one knew, so they just said, hey, we'll just go right through it. So while they're cutting trees, there was the American lumbermen and Canadian or British Canadian lumbermen who saw each other, and then they were pretty much saying, hey, why are you cutting, this part of the land? This is not yours. And so they kind of had like a lumberjack clash, an Aroostook war, until they sent the ambassadors. America sent, Webster, while British guys sent Lord Ashburton. And then they made a dispute. Okay, this is now going to be the line. Let's make a deal. You take this, you take that. So that's what happened. 7,000 square miles of 12,000 square miles wilderness in dispute. So another thing that happened was, to make matters worse, there was this Caroline affair. Now, what happened is that there was a little bit of a protest going on in Canada, and these guys were wanting independence from Britain, just like America was, and the Americans supported that. And so there was a ship sent from America, the Caroline, right? And then they found out that these people were helping the rebels of Canada. The British found out that the Americans were helping the Canadian rebels to support this independence in Canada. So what happened is they kind of burned down the ship, right? Because of this. And we call this the Caroline Affair. So now, what does this have to do with the deal with Maine? During negotiations, the Caroline Affair, malingering since 1837, was patched up by an exchange of diplomatic notes. Okay, they said, okay, we'll release those guys which we arrested, and then you can take some of that land. You get the land from Minnesota, and then we'll get the land in Maine. So that's how they negotiated that final boundary dispute. And then remember, Texas fought for their independence, right? And finally, they knew that Texas would have to join the United States because France and British are all trying to make deals with Texas to kind of bother America. Because if you have another nation there, it kind of offsets the market. If America's the only one in North America selling cotton whatsoever, then they can make the prices high. But if say there's another country selling cotton, like in Texas, well, Texas can make more money because they can sell the cotton cheaper and they can ignore America's cotton. So they eventually had a relationship with America. You see this title here is called the Belated Texas Nuptials. James K. Polk, slave power. Okay. So this is eventually Texas was invited to join in, and this is under President James K. Polk. Okay, so now Texas is now part of America. So you can see slowly the boundaries are being really fixed in Maine, and then in Texas, and now Oregon. Lots of people are moving to Oregon. Now, Oregon, it also includes today's Washington State and the state of Oregon all in one, and there's this Columbus River in the middle of it. But here's the problem. In the Columbus River, which is today's border between Washington and Oregon State, in the Columbia River, there was British people living north of the river, and there were Americans living south of the river. So you would think that, okay, Americans will live north of that river, and Americans will live south of that river, and the British will live north of that river. And that was the original idea. That's going to be the border, right? But it wasn't like that. They had to really, James K. Polk basically was really greedy and says, no, 54-40 or fight, okay? So there was more people, actually there was more people moving from America into that region, pouring it in. So just because there's American population there, does that make it America's? British may have claimed it first, but there's more people living there, hundreds and hundreds. So it's either 49th parallel or the 54. James K. Polk had to find a way to take it, okay? So he said 54, 40, or 5. Well, he wasn't going to get 54 degrees and 40 degrees. All of Oregon or none. All of Oregon or none. Okay, so yes, they're only going to get up to, they're not going to get 54, 40. They're going to not even get a 5. So they're just going to get up to the 49th. Polk wanted up to here, but the British says that's just too much. Actually, the British wanted up to here. Americans want up to here. Actually, Americans asking too much. Actually, this should be British because there's British people living there. But instead, they got up to 49th, and that was the deal. That was the trade-off that they were able to have. Okay, so James K. Polk became the president because people were really wanting to expand. Finally, misunderstandings with Mexico. You're about to have a Mexican-American war here. This is not good. This is going to happen. This is how we're going to get California and all those places that we have today in this Mexican-American war. Now, but Polk was already showing that he always wanted California from Mexico. He was always offering money to Mexico. Now, you have to remember that at this time, California was in Mexican hands. So is Arizona, and so is also parts of Utah and Colorado. that was in Mexican hands. So Polk was already trying to take it, all right? So they already took Texas, so it looks like they're slowly going and taking the rest of it. And then they had a disputed border between the Rio Grande or the Nueces River. Now, today, the Rio Grande is the main border, but actually, the Mexicans are arguing that no, the Nueces is the main border. Of course, that's higher up north. So Mexicans have more land than Americans. Of course, they'll choose the Rio Grande because it gives America more land. So which river is really the border? The Nueces River or the Rio Grande? In any case, it was all disputable. It was no man's land. No one should go there because it's still going to be a power cave, right? No one should claim it yet until it's finally the safest way to sell it. Okay. Now, John Slidell finally was almost like he was giving an ultimatum. Go back to Mexico and ask one last time, $25 million for California, okay? And all of it to the east. But the proud Mexican people didn't even permit Slidell to present his insulting proposition. So right after this, secretly, Polk, maybe he felt that they were going to reject it. He starts sending General Zachary Taylor down to the Rio Grande into no man's land, even though that land wasn't settled yet, but he's acting like, okay, I'm gonna extend the defense line towards the Rio Grande, even though that place is not settled yet. Okay, so they're here. American soldiers led by General Zachary Taylor are there. I wonder why. But then suddenly, Mexico attacks American soldiers in that region. Okay. Now, American soldiers, some die. So Polk says American blood has been spilled. So he's going to ask Congress to declare war, right? Now, it wasn't like everyone was going to war. Actually, there's one guy who said, wait a minute, show us the spot where the people died. Who is this congressman saying, show us the spot? This is Abraham Lincoln. He's in the House. And he said, hey, why would we go to war? Well, let's see whose fault it really is, right? If American blood was really spilled on our land, our soil, then we know that's the Mexicans' fault who crossed. But what if the American blood was spilled in Mexican land? And that would indicate we crossed their border, so they had every right to defend themselves or even attack the Americans. They didn't want to show where the spot was where they died. They knew that possibly Polk provoked the war so they could have reason to get California. So, in either case, both were spoiling for a fight. They wanted to fight. They thought they were very proud. Mexicans thought that they could even challenge America at the time. So, here's a map. You can see all of this was going to be America. Okay. This map is important to show all that. Okay, so you're gonna have to know a few guys here. Stephen Kearny, basically generals who are going to go to their respective areas to conquer or to attack Mexico. The still Mexican dictator is still Santa Anna. He returned. He was actually exiled, and then he was able to return. Stephen Kearny led a detachment to Santa Fe, New Mexico, okay, and it was easily captured. Actually, Stephen Kearny wasn't in combat because the northern Mexicans were like, hey, come here, take over. We don't want to be part of Mexico. Now, the problem with the northern Mexican territories, they were so separated from Mexico City, from the capital, from the government, that they already felt non-Mexican. And they already felt like, to be part of America wasn't that bad. So that's why the people of Santa Fe and New Mexico accepted Stephen Kearny, easily saved it over. Okay, what about John C. Fremont? Now, John C. Fremont, he was headed to today's California. Okay, and when he arrived in California, mainly in San Francisco, okay, they started to raise the bear flag in that region, and the locals helped Fremont to take California. You can see Fremont here. You see on the top, going to San Francisco to take it. Okay, and then General Zachary Taylor, he is not over yet, right? They have today's all American, and Kearny continues on and takes San Diego and LA and upwards. But now they have those places, should they go down and take the capital city, Mexico City? Yes. So they switched from Zachary Taylor to General Winfield Scott, and they had the Battle of Veracruz, and Veracruz is the port city, and then they went to the capital of Mexico City, and then they've taken Mexico. Now that they defeated Mexico, even up to the capital, Nicholas P. Trist is going to Santa Anna, exchanging an armistice. Now, he is told to get as much Mexico as you can, even all of Mexico, if you could, down to Mexico City. Can you imagine if America was able to even take that much land? We know we only got to California and Texas, right? I know that's in today's map. But what if America got all the way down to Mexico? It would have been a big United States of America, right? But they didn't settle. They just settled for California, Arizona, and New Mexico, and those would be up to there in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So this disappointed James K. Polk because he wanted a lot of it. Now remember, you have to see this treaty here. Nicholas Trist was feeling bad. They knew that America was going to war with Mexico. A lot of Mexicans died, even some Americans died, because of James K. Polk, the presidents agreed to just get more southern land. Now, remember how if that land is south of that border, do you remember the Missouri Compromise line? That compromise line says anything that is south of this, they can be a slave state. Imagine how many slave states would have been coming into America. James K. Polk's plan. It would have been huge. But they knew that it was not easy to govern all of this. All these Mexicans, will they really be American? Are they really going to be good gringos? No, they wouldn't. So, profit and loss in Mexico. Yes, so there's some benefits. Some leaders came out of this. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, they're going to be made better generals. As you know, they will fight in the Civil War later. Here's a picture of all these missions in California. The Spanish planted a lot of missions. That's why you have these names like San Diego, San Luis Rey, San Juan, San Buenaventura, Santa Barbara, San Gabriel, San Fernando. Okay, all these are Spanish forts and missions. Okay, that's how we still have the names today. Okay, a lot of officers were being trained from this war. These are all just the results of it. A lot of benefits. But then it also moved abolitionists to go against the Mexican conflict because the abolitionists knew that this would just expand slavery. Okay, finally, a big one that really upsets a lot of the people. David Wilmot proposes a proviso. And this proviso suggests, hey, what if he suggests that all the states, territories captured from Mexico, that none of them should be slave. And this is what Polk doesn't want. He took it to make it slave states. Now, he just upsets a whole bunch of Southern congressmen, and it really symbolized the burning issue of slavery, right? And everyone knew that this is going to be the decision has to be made eventually. Should slavery continue or not? Okay, so this is chapter 17, Manifest Destiny.
Okay, here we are. Okay, here we are, chapter 18, renewing the sectional struggle. Now, this is the time when America goes really close to the Civil War. This is the idea that the sections, which is North and South, are trying to balance slave states and free states. They're trying to even the playing field. For example, there's 10 free states, then there should be 10 slave states, 11, and then 11, 12, 12, so forth. But it really depends if the states are willing to compromise, right? Well, it's going to eventually become one region, which is the North, is going to become more free than the other. So you can't really balance it out. So it will come to a tipping point. Okay, so popular sovereignty panacea. The Democratic National Convention will select General Lewis Cass, okay, veteran of the War of 1812. Okay, these Democrats are going to have to, all of these candidates have to address the question of the sections. What is their position? Are they for free or are they for slave state? Well, some people choose the middle ground, meaning popular sovereignty, let the people decide if they want free or slave. Popular sovereignty's idea is majority vote. Let the people decide what status they want their new state to become. So territories would come in. And the Whigs they had a problem. First, they were kind of divided. They chose Zachary Taylor, and the Whigs were unsure to choose. And the Free Soil Party is obvious. They want the rest of the territories to be free. They came out foursquare for the Wilmot Proviso and against slavery in the territories. The new party assembled a strange assortment of new fellows in the same political bed. Okay. And then there was also the conscience Whigs. So now we have the Whigs who supported free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Okay, and they selected President Van Buren. Free soilers condemned slavery, not so much for enslaving blacks, but for destroying the chance of free white workers to rise up from the wage-earning dependence to the esteemed status of self-employment. Okay, so the Free Soil Party eventually would foreshadow the emergence of the Republican Party soon after. All right. Eventually, the winner is going to be Taylor's wartime popularity pulled him through. He won 163 electoral votes. So he became the winner of the Democratic Party, right? So the slavery is still going to be an issue. It's still not abolished completely until the Republican Party comes in this form. Okay, California just comes in as a territory and it's applying to become a state soon. Now, there wasn't much people in California to begin with until something happened at Sutter's Mill, California. Sutter's Mill is near Sacramento, And what happened is there was many mills being built, and mills is, again, to spins the water. It spins this mill to generate like some sort of power or to grind something, and they were building this mill. But then while they're building this, there was some gold that was found, but it was supposed to be a secret, right? So instead, one of the owner, Sutter, he said, "Do not tell anyone about this." Of course, they're going to tell someone. It was actually the maid who told everyone at Sacramento all the way down to San Francisco that there's gold everywhere in this region. Now, of course, they didn't want to tell anyone because they could get it all for themselves. So, because of this gold, many people migrated to California in the thousands, hundreds of thousands, so fast. And you would think that they would populate Arizona first and Utah, and then they would populate New Mexico, Colorado. No, California was quickly populated more than the others because of this gold. Now, if this state grows so fast, then that means it wasn't ready. There's a lot of systems that still need to be built up. Then they were able to draft a constitution in 1849, and the Californians excluded slavery and then applied for it. Now, here's the problem. California was allowed to make their own constitution, and they chose not to have it. But California, most of it rests below the Missouri Compromise line of the 54, 51 latitude line that was decided. And so there should have been slavery as it was decided in the Missouri Compromise in 1824. But in 1849, about 20 years later, 25 years later, they said we don't want to become a slave state. So this will become an issue. What should California choose? Okay. So California, if California becomes a free state, then it would ruin the balance because there's already 15 slaves and 15 free states. California would be 16 free states and 15 slave states. So now that means they wanted to quickly add the other territories of New Mexico and Utah to become also non-slave states. And that would be even bigger, 18 free states and 15 slave states. So the fate of California might well establish a precedent for the rest of the Mexican cession territory and an area purchased largely with Southern blood. This is an issue. A lot of Southerners died to get these territories, and a lot of them wanted to make these states slave states, but the states themselves didn't want to become slave states. They wanted to become free states. Okay. So what will happen now? Texas had a huge land. It was very, very huge. So they had to give up some Texas land and to form present-day New Mexico. And the District of Columbia, which is today's DC, they also wanted to abolish slavery, and they were going to do it gradually. And the Underground Railroad was a big deal because there were many slaves who were escaping, and there was someone helping them. It was Harriet Tubman. There were many of these so-called conductors, and they would go in these stations. And it wasn't literally like an underground railroad, like there's a train. Obviously, they can hear it, and they'll know that where the slaves are running off to. But stations meaning that there were houses and little places where they would hide in the cover. This picture right here, they would hide behind here, and they would make their way all the way up north, further north into Canada. They wouldn't just stop like in northern part of America, like in Massachusetts or something. They would go all the way to Canada where slavery is outlawed. If you only end up in New York, they can still catch you. So Southerners were upset at this with the government, so they wanted a more strict slave law, a fugitive slave law, to get those slaves returned back. Okay. Now, the ones that were helping the slaves escape were actually the abolitionists who supported and ran the Underground Railroad. Okay. So the Southerners, they rested their argument on a constitution which protected slavery and the laws of Congress and provided for slave catching. So they based it, the Southerners says, hey, do we have the right to have our slaves to be returned to us? They should be rightfully returned to us, protected. Okay, so now we have a huge battle going on here. We have the immortal trio who is going to try to form a compromise one last time. Clay, Calhoun, Webster, the great compromiser. All of these guys are very old. They've been trying to keep the nation together. These congressmen are trying to say, hey, respect our rights. Hey, let's work together, right? So all of them are working. And they're going to come up with the compromise of 1850, which is this right here. If California really wants to become a free state, so what does the South say? Okay, if we concede California to become a free state, then that means the rest of the Mexican areas or the territories that we won from Mexico, as far as Utah, let the people decide by popular sovereignty what it'll be. We're not saying it's going to become free. Now we're neither saying it's going to become slave, but let the people decide, at least that. So that they're hoping that their Southerners would quickly move in there and make it into a slave state by their votes. Second concession, Texas. Texas territory is already a slave state. They would give up some of their territory to New Mexico. But Texas has received $10 million from the government. Okay, that's what the South wants. They want money. Abolition of the slave trade, but not slavery in the District of Columbia. Okay, they want to, okay, so the people of the North say, get rid of the slave trade from coming into DC, but you won't get rid of slavery. And the South said, we want a stricter fugitive slave law. That was what they wanted. Okay, so this is the deal. This is the proposal. This is what they're trying to pass. However, it was deadlocked. They couldn't vote, so it was getting pretty intense. Many people weren't sure. It was about to die and it'll be useless. Now, something happened. Why wouldn't they vote for this compromise? Why wouldn't they just allow the South to get, make it a win-win situation, 50-50? That was because some of the Northerners who were strong abolitionists, William H. Seward, for example, from New York, he came out unequivocally against secession. He says, do not even give the South anything. It is just wrong. It is more important to obey God's moral law than to follow the constitutional law. There is a higher law. So he was saying, yeah, Constitution may protect the rights, but there's a higher law than the Constitution, and that's God's law, and God forbids slavery. So because of this, many people say, you know what, forget it. We're not going to sign that compromise of 1850. Okay, until the president, because Taylor dies, right? And then the vice president, Millard Fillmore, becomes president, and he signs a series of compromises, and it is finally passed. Of course, the South was also just as upset because there was also the people who are like the opposite of the higher law believers. They says, do not even help the North. They are taking advantage of us, just boycott Northern goods. So there was already this feeling of Southern secession. They were already thinking of leaving. Okay, balancing. California, a free state now, tipped the Senate balance permanently against the South. Territories, New York, New Mexico, and Utah were open to slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. But they have to wait till they become a state. And Texas received $10 million. It had a long debt, but there was a big help for Texas. So this is how it now looks. Okay, it is 16-15, but then these territories will decide later. The decision to be slave or free will be up to them. And the new Fugitive Slave Act was now more serious than ever. Whoever helps a slave escape will go to jail. Whoever returns a slave will be rewarded. So more people, abolitionists, didn't like this. They didn't like the idea that the government would support Southerners returning slaves who were trying to run away. Okay. Here we are. Now, these places are all unorganized territories. They will become states later. Green and blue, they already have decided their position, but the rest of them will be decided by the people. Now, when these slaves were running away and the abolitionists were helping them, they would see these slaves who would be so close to escape, and yet they'll get caught and be brought back. Some states passed personal liberty laws, allowing the slaves to defend themselves in court. Okay. The Southerners, in turn, were embittered because of the Northerners would not, in good faith, execute the law. The one real and immediate Southern gain from the Great Compromise redoubled their efforts. With every passing decade, the huge section was forging further ahead in population and wealth, in crops, factories, foundries, ships, and railroads. Okay, so in the meantime, the North was growing, getting more factories going and everything. So this time the North was getting materially prosperous, which will be helpful in the upcoming Civil War. Defeat and doom for the Whigs. The Whig Party is gone. Now, what happens? Why here? Why is the Whig Party, destroyed or disappears? Because they're going to give way to the Republican Party. Because the Whig platform praised the Compromise of 1850 as a lasting arrangement, right? But still, there are people upset because the anti-slavery Whigs of the North didn't want, and it's a problem. The Whig Party was so divided because there was people who didn't want slavery, so swallowed Scott as their nominee, but deplored the platform, meaning they accepted Scott, but they hated his platform because he supported the fugitive slave law. And then the Southern Whigs, who doubted Scott's loyalty to the Compromise of 1850, especially the fugitive slave law, accepted the platform but spat at the candidate. So the Northern and Southern Whigs were divided. That's why they couldn't get a candidate done. So significance, it marked the effective end of the disorganized Whig Party. Within a few years, it's complete. Within a few years, it's dead. So they accepted this, and now the Whig Party is gone. So what is the next party? If the Democrats are the only ones, the Free Soil Party would be there. Who would be the replacement party? Okay, and now we have kind of a different part of history here. Now, we're talking about like diplomacy now, so this is a different section. basically, the British started to break the Monroe Doctrine rules. Not really rule, but that was the policy. Do not let any British interfere. The British came down to Nicaragua's coast, and then in the port of San Juan, and they drove the governments of both the United States and New Granada to conclude an important treaty. It guaranteed the American right of an isthmus. Okay, so basically, America needed to get an isthmus. An isthmus. This is like a small strip of land because people you have to go around South America to go to either Pacific or Atlantic Ocean. So let's imagine in California, right? There's a Navy base. Have to go all the way around to Virginia's base and have to go through South. They couldn't find a way to go through South America because there was no waterway made yet. So they had to find a place, and eventually they're going to get a place called Panama Canal. Now, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty stipulated that neither America nor Britain would fortify or seek control of a future waterway. Of course, they're going to get one. So Nicaragua was already the place where they were starting to think of having to get it there. Here's Nicaragua. See how they were going to do like this? Of course, in the future, it's going to be here, but they're trying to get this. But British is influencing this area, so this is why it's becoming a problem. Now, another nation, Cuba. President Polk wanted to buy Cuba. He offered Spain $100 million for Cuba. 2 filibustering expeditions, and there's people gathering. Hundreds of men were getting ready to go to Cuba, and then this was actually they weren't supposed to, but Spanish officials seized an American steamer called the Black Warrior and found out that they had plans to seize Cuba. The major powers of England, France, and Russia were about to become bogged down in the Crimean War, and hence were unable to aid Spain. So America was already having plans to take Cuba, but something happened. The Austin Manifesto. There was a document, and there was a secret document saying that if Spain refused to sell Cuba to America, then America would come up with a reason to go to war and get Cuba from Spain. So America's looking really bad here. This message, the Austin Manifesto, leaked out, and then America is looking for ways to get Cuba, right? So that's filled in the news, so they stopped doing it. Now, why can't they just do it regardless of what the news says? Because if they go on with it, then they'll know that America actually forced it open. California and Oregon. Okay, so now we're talking about Asia. Now that they have the West Coast, now China is a market, right? The British first opened the market and they controlled most of the Chinese market, right? And that was kind of like they were kind of cheating. It's a story about that. And they just had war with Hong Kong. And then now they took Hong Kong. Now America they want a piece of China. Okay. Now how would they get it? Where would they get a piece of it? Now it would be in Macau first. Okay, so they were able to go kill Cushing, secure the deal in the Treaty of Wangya, and they got rights. And they told Chinese, you better accept America as the most favored nation. Okay, and so now Chinese opened up to America, and missionaries started coming into China. And then there was Japan. Matthew C. Perry opened up Japan. Now, Japan was very strict. Dynasty didn't allow any foreigners for about 200, 300 years to come to America. Now, how did to come to Japan? But how did the Americans do it? Well, they had a strategy. First, Matthew C. Perry comes in with his ships and shooting his cannons. Of course, there's no cannonballs, but just making loud noises. And then came with an American, tallest Americans, African Americans, and they gave a box that said, we want to make friendly relations. We'll come back next year and let us know your decision. So the next year came, or 2 years later. This time, 7 men of war came, and they said, hey, if you trade with us, you get all this technology, including this locomotive. So the Japanese were so shocked, and they said, let's sign a treaty. We'll open our land to America. Treaty of Kanagawa was established, and now Americans started coming in. They had the rights to make trade. So America cracked open Japan's 2-century isolation. But when the Japanese knew how far behind they were in technology, the emperor says, we got to change and restore back ourselves because we're so behind. So that was the Meiji Restoration. And it was would end the era of the shogunate, all the samurai stuff, and propel the land and the rising sun headlong into the modern world. Pacific Railroad promoters and the Gadsden Purchase. Okay. So basically, they had to buy this land from Mexico right here so that they could build a railroad. So they gave money to Mexico. It's Tucson right here. And now they could build this railroad track. And so that was the Gadsden Purchase for $10 million. Okay, now we have Douglas and Kansas-Nebraska scheme. Douglas has a plan. He's actually in Chicago. And he proposes that the territory of Nebraska could be into 2 territories, Nebraska and Kansas. And then the North would be free and the South would be slave. But there's a problem. Kansas and Nebraska is both above the Missouri Compromise line, so both of them should be free. But anyway, he wanted to try to see if it'll work, if he could satisfy the Southerners and pass this Kansas-Nebraska bill. Okay, so everyone was upset because they knew that those two territories should become states or free states. Okay, so he didn't care about. He says, let the people decide. Both of these are above the 3630 line. He said this should be slave, this should be free. So now the slaves have an opportunity. This caused a lot of problems. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act wrecked two compromises, 1820 and 1850. Okay. So this is how it's going to end. At the same time, while this is going on, 1856, the Republican Party is born. This is where President Lincoln is going to be part of the Republican Party, and that kind of replaces the Whig Party, the Free Soil Party, the American Party. All of these parties come together with one goal: to get rid of slavery, and it's going to go against the Democratic Party. Okay, all right. So that is chapter 18. Okay, we are in chapter 19. This is drifting towards disunion. We're going to talk about some politics, social, and economical even, of what made the North and South become so different and how led to conflict. So this is right before the era of the Civil War, 1861. So let's first talk about the culture being created here. First, you have Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe was a very famous woman who wrote a book. The book is what got her famous. And she basically wrote a book about the cruelness and wickedness of slavery and how there's such sad, there's some sad stories about slavery. For example, when she wrote a story how a slave almost ran away, but got caught in the North. And because of this, the slave had to actually be brought back to the South just to be killed in the end. So this was a very great book. And even Lincoln even kind of said, you're the little woman who wrote this book that made this great war. So this book is so significant because it made so many copies, it was sold, and it helped awaken the North to more go against slavery and against the South here. So that's Harriet Beecher Stowe. There was also, this book also reached as far as London and Paris. And because of this book, many people, the majority of the Europeans, especially in London and Paris, were against slavery even more. And if the government supported the South, because in the end, England would help, but the people went against its own country, England, whenever they secretly supported the South. Another book, which was written by Hinton Helper, is actually a non-aristocratic white from North Carolina. You know, he's white, but then he wrote a book called The Impending Crisis of the South, and he was proving that actually the white people are suffering the most because of slavery, that lots of white people are not rich because of this plantation owner system. This is the reason why a lot of whites would be suffering because of slavery. So he wrote this, The Impending Book of the South. It's almost like he wrote against the Southerners. All right, we distributed as campaign literature by the Republicans. Okay, so people were reading this. Now, what happened in Kansas? Now, Kansas is about to be blown up as a powder keg. Now, remember, many people are moving into Kansas so they can become the majority to vote when it becomes a state. Right now, it's just a territory, and now they're in the middle of creating their constitution. There's this famous New England Emigrant Aid Company, which is an anti-slavery organization, which sent 2,000 people to Kansas, right? And to also, of course, to forestall the South and also to make a profit because the Southerners are also trying to move in. And even the relative or Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, even helped to raise money to move into Kansas as well. So everyone's moving into Kansas, and they're hoping to get their philosophy or their platform of whether it's slavery or anti-slavery or free to be there. So there's a lot of them who were moving into these little cities and towns. A lot of them are in the east side of Kansas. So we have these cities: Topeka, Lecompton, Lawrence, Shawnee Mission, right here in edge of Missouri, Kansas City. So you call these people from Missouri who are Southerners who support slavery, pro-slavery, border ruffians, who would go to Missouri and vote early and more than once so that they could put the majority of the popular sovereignty of Kansas to become a slave state. Of course, that's kind of illegal to vote twice, 3 times, just to make it seem like there's a lot of people who support a slave state when the Constitution is being built. They established a government called Shawnee Mission, a little town there, puppet government. And the against these border ruffians were the Free Soil Party, and they established themselves at Topeka. Okay, and what's going to happen is there's going to be tensions growing, and then a bunch of settlers are going to have lots of conflicting land claims, and then there's going to be a breaking point. Pro-slavery raiders are going to burn a Free Soil Party's town called Lawrence. So this is a free soil, remember, free soil is who wants no slaves in that land. That's Free Soil Party versus the pro-slavery party. So they burnt it. The pro-slavery guys burnt it. Now, what's going to happen as a result of this? John Brown is this guy right here with burning passion. He's actually from Massachusetts, or he's somewhere from New England, okay? Springfield, Massachusetts, and working with other New England abolitionists, including Frederick Douglass. So when he hears that there was this sack of Lawrence, where a lot of the Free Soil Party, their town was burnt, he was upset and frustrated. So what he did is he took matters into his own hands. So all the way from New England, he goes down to Kansas into Potawatomi Creek, and then he gets some pro-slavery people, probably they were innocent, and he hacks them into pieces. This is like cruel, cold-blooded murder just because of their political affiliation. So this ended up having a civil war in Kansas, just erupted into a kind of mini civil war in Kansas, not nationally, but in Kansas, where you have Free Soil Party people versus pro-slavery party people. Finally, in 1857, Kansas had enough people, mainly free soil people, and they applied for statehood because on the basis of popular sovereignty, whoever has the most becomes the main law. And it happened to be that they were against slavery, and the free soils get to create their own constitution. But the pro-slavery guys wanted to add something to that. The pro-slavery forces, then in the saddle, devised a tricky document known as the Lecompton Constitution. The people were not allowed to vote for or against the Constitution as a whole, but for the Constitution either with slavery or with no slavery. If they voted against slavery, one of the main provisions of the Constitution would protect the owners of slaves already in Kansas. So whatever the outcome, there would still be slaves. So basically, if they're going to go against slavery, they can't get rid of the slaves who are already there first, those who own slaves. So it's kind of like not getting rid of their slaves. And so this caused a problem because the majority wanted slaves out. Okay. Now, what to do? The president, James Buchanan, under a lot of Southern influence, okay, blinded by the visions within his own Democratic Party, he supported this Lecompton Constitution, half slavery, half free, just keep those who brought the slaves in first, let them have their slaves. So Senator Douglas also said, hey, this is popular, who championed true popular sovereignty, would have none of this semi-popular fraudulency, okay? Okay, he fought for fair play, saying, let's go make it fair. Lecompton is not making it fair. So the Free Soil Party were basically asking for a revote in a sense. Okay, and then another thing happened in the Chamber of Congress. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, okay, he had a speech, the crime against Kansas. He, in the middle of the speech, he's supporting the Free Soil Party. He's going against slavery. He's making fun of the South Carolina senator until his relative, the senator's relative, gets vengeance in his own hands. He goes to the desk of Charles Sumner, and with his cane, he beats him in front of all those people. And you know what? No one stops it. Actually, the Southerners were letting, Charles Sumner be beaten by the Southern congressman. So we call this Bleeding Sumner. Okay, just like there's Bleeding Kansas, Bleeding Sumner. And it was a very, very intense debate. We call this the Sumner Brooks clash because Brooks was one that was beating Sumner. This is crazy. This is happening in the political party. People are beating each other up with canes, and they're even old people. You can imagine that. Okay, so now there's an election right here. Election of 1856. Democrats versus the Republican Party. James Buchanan was chosen, and John C. Fremont was chosen for the Republican Party. This is the first time the Republican Party is going to go for a presidency. And then you have a know-nothing party right here. Millard Fillmore. So the Democrats won. The Republicans didn't win in their first attempt as a party. Fremont lost much ground because of grave doubts as to his honesty, capacity, and sound judgment. Okay, so 1856, the Republican didn't win. The Republicans, their platform is they're against slavery. That's just in its pure form. And so they were very worried if they were to become the next in line. Okay, the Dred Scott decision. This is a big deal. Now, there was a slave, a black slave named Dred Scott, and he was suing for his freedom. So what happens is he was brought from Missouri, and he went up north, but then his master died up north. So what should this position of the slave be? The master is dead. Is he a slave or not? He's in the north. He should be free. He goes to court. Hey, I should be free. But the court rules that because you are still property, actually, the court decreed that a slave is still property. And even though he's taken to any territory, even if it's a free territory, he is still a slave there according to the legal law, whatever. So this is an uproar. And then people wondered, well, what about the constitutional law about the Compromise of 1820? What about that? Didn't we say that whoever's up there is free? And the judge said, actually, that compromise is unconstitutional this whole time. Congress has no power to ban slavery from the territories. So this judge just upset a lot of Northerners. This judge was upholding slavery even though the Dred Scott's master died. I don't know who Dred Scott's going to be laboring under, the invisible master or the ghost, but he's still a slave to no one. So this is just a ridiculous decision. Okay, 1857, they had a financial crash. Okay, a lot of it's because of speculation. One, speculation. Speculation means a lot of people bought land in the West thinking that people are going to buy the land, but they borrowed money from a bank to buy the land, and no one bought those lands. So they lost a lot of money. The bank says, pay us back. They couldn't pay them back. And so they gave a lot of money to people for nothing. They couldn't pay back. The banks lost money. Also, the Crimean War, the grain. What happened is people were buying grain in America, but then, and when the Crimean War was over, now they said, okay, let's buy grain back. We need to buy grain from America. So this led to this financial problem. Okay, just financial panic there. And to encourage more people to live west, they passed the Homestead Act. One of that made public lands available at 25 cents an acre. That's the Homestead Act. Okay, it's very cheap. Okay. Okay. An Illinois rail splitter. As you know, this is Abraham Lincoln in his prime, so young, huge hands, huge ears, very tall guy, born in a Kentucky log cabin with poor parents. Okay, he was self-educated. He always told stories. He married a high-ranking woman, married Todd, and he read a little bit of law and he passed the bar exam. And he was known for wearing a stovepipe hat all the time. And he was running for, not president, he was running for Senate. But his challenger is Senator Stephen Douglas. He's been there. You know, he's a veteran, and Lincoln's just in the game. So he's going to have some debates. Just like there was debates when we watching television, there's also debates in that time, and they're having debates about topics. And the biggest debatable topic is slavery. So the people of the territory would vote slavery down. Okay, the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott decision had decreed that they could not. Who could prevail, the court or the people? So he had a logic, right? Lincoln was saying, slavery. Why was slavery so loud even though it's above the line? Isn't against the Missouri Compromise line? But then Dred Scott says the people will decide, and so the people decided to keep slaves. So this is the Freeport. So Lincoln says, or his reply to Lincoln became known as the Freeport Doctrine, meaning that the people should have the authority. Laws to protect slavery would have to be passed by the territorial legislatures. These would not be forthcoming in the absence of popular approval, and black bondage would soon disappear. So his argument is it's going to disappear later because it's up to the people. People will want it to disappear. Okay. So Lincoln didn't get the job to become senator. I guess he'd have to look for a job elsewhere. Hopefully he gets a good one. Senator Douglas keeps his position as the Illinois Senate senator. Okay. So after his position to the Constitution for Kansas and his further defiance of the Supreme Court at Freeport, Southern Democrats were determined to break up the party and the Union rather than accept him. The Lincoln-Douglas debate platform does prove to be one of the preliminary battlefields of the Civil War. Okay, John Brown. Again, he is back in action. Remember the guy who murdered pro-slavery people in Kansas? He's going to do something crazy again. Harper's Ferry. He has this plan. He's going to get all the guns in D.C. and he's going to give it to all the slaves who are being a slave, and they're going to fight for their freedom. So he breaks into the arsenal, into the base. But then no slaves came to help him. He just killed people, murdered some soldiers. Of course, he brought some people with him. And the only people that came was Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee to arrest him. Okay, so John Brown went to trial. He didn't want to say he was going to plead insane. He was going to die a martyr. And it's either he's going to inspire people or he's going to get people upset at him. Well, moderate Republicans like Lincoln says, no, we do not support what John Brown did, trying to damage property and give it to slaves. It's causing problems. But strict abolitionists, radical one says, good job, John Brown. Nice try to get those weapons and giving it to the slaves and cause a problem in the South. Okay, on the day of his execution, free soilers in the North tolled bells, fired guns, lowered flags, and held rallies. Some spoke of St. John Brown. So yes, they were supporting this. Okay, now there's an election of 1860, and now Lincoln is asked for a job to run for president. Now, there are, in a sense, one Republican Party and almost like three Democrat parties. Now, Breckinridge is not, or Bell is not a Democrat, but let's just say John Bell, Union Party. Even if you do the math correctly, right, you have to count the Electoral College vote. If you have two Democrats who are running, you divide the vote up. It's a problem. Now, if you just look at the numbers, if you count 1.3 million plus 848,000, it will be 2.1. 2.1 is bigger than 1.8. If they didn't divide, Lincoln would have lost. If the Democrats just chose one person, combine all the people's votes together, Douglas or Breckinridge would have become the president, Lincoln would have won. Lincoln won because the Democrats were divided. So this is what happens. So Lincoln then becomes president. Now, a Republican, their first victory, their first presidency. What's going to happen now? What does it mean to have a Republican president in the office? Everyone was surprised. Now, when this happened, this is what the South said. Lincoln won, Republican Party, that he's now going to get rid of slavery. So they already said they are going to secede. What does it mean? The secessionists means to disconnect themselves from the United States. South Carolina did it first. Then 6 other states followed. Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. 4 more were joining. Eventually, you're going to leave. And then they formed their own country, the Confederate States of America. And they elected their president, Jefferson Davis. So does the South have a right to leave the United States and form their own country? Who said? Why didn't the president do anything? Now, remember, Lincoln doesn't come to office until March 4. So the previous president, which is Buchanan, has to do something, but he says, what can I do? I'm leaving. So you have this, in 3 months, this lame duck session. Remember, in November, they could announce who the winner is. Okay. And so they could not find any reason. So one important reason why he did not resort to force was that the tiny standing army of 15,000. Buchanan couldn't do anything. He didn't have much men to stop the secession. Now, they tried to compromise one last time. Slavery in the territories was to be prohibited north of 3630. Let's keep the balance. Keep it above free and keep below this line slave. But Lincoln rejected Crittenden's scheme, and all hope of compromise evaporated. Lincoln opposed slavery, and he felt that it's a matter of principle. So that doesn't give any hope for the Confederates, the Southerners, to come back into the nation. The Confederates just said, just leave us alone. All we ask is to be left alone so we can keep our slaves, form our own economy. We don't want any trouble. But should war come, the immense debt owed to Northern creditors by the South, happily thought, could be repudiated. Well, if we went to war, at least we don't have to pay back. So Southerners didn't mind. They thought of themselves as a win-win situation. So the Southerners felt they were just declaring their independence just as much as they did against Britain. But was this really independence? Can they just leave like that? Can the South just form their own country? So this is how this starts, the Civil War. Well, it's going to lead to the Civil War. All right, so this is chapter 20, Burning for War, the North and South. Okay, so this is how the war began and the politics behind it. This is not about the battles yet. So they separated it for chapter 21. But for chapter 20, it's more like the context, the background, the diplomatic things going on, and they want to just separate that from another one because there's just so much things going on in the Civil War that one chapter is not enough. Okay, so let's see the political things related to it and social things related. Now, there would be no conflict unless the South provoked it, meaning no one expected to have a battle in the Civil War. No one expected to be bloodshed. They were all trying to avoid bloodshed in the Civil War. Lincoln believed that no matter what, the United States, they are together. It'll be hard for us to be separated. We are, because of the way the geographical makeup is designed in America. So a civil war shouldn't have happened. He believed that we are all usually it's a small problem. We can get back everyone together. But other nations were kind of hoping for a civil war because the United States was so powerful. It was trading a lot, making a lot of money. And then if the United States were divided, then the other nations could play that to their favor. They could make good deals and all that stuff. Okay, and it'll be the end of the Monroe Doctrine so that, they could now trade within America if they don't get what they want. So this is why having two nations is going to be a beneficial prospect for the other nations all around. Okay, so let's see how this began then. How did the conflict begin? So there were bases in Charleston. Now there's bases all over the South. Those are United States property, right? Those are the national government's property, the federal government. Should those bases go to the South who left the United States? Well, most of them did, and they all just, surrendered and gave themselves whatever was in those bases, those forts, the ammunition, the weapons, the soldiers in there. This is all federal. This is no longer federal property. This is now property of the Confederate States of America. But Fort Sumter, and another one, Fort Sumter in Charleston didn't surrender. They said no, even though it's in South Carolina, which is a state that seceded. It says no, this is federal property. This is the United States. We will not surrender the ammunition here. We're not going to give up this base. So what's going to happen then? If Lincoln tries to rescue it by attacking the South, then Lincoln will be responsible for starting the war. If the South defends it, or if the South takes it over and starts killing the people inside that fort, then they'll be responsible for starting the war. So whoever is going to, make a first move in this fort to either save it or take it from them is going to start the war. So Lincoln had to adopt a middle road solution. How do you solve this dilemma? Lincoln is going to send provision to the garrison, not reinforce it. So he says he's just going to send food for people there who are going to be starving soon. Okay. And then what now would Jefferson Davis do? It's his move. There's troops coming in to send food. They're just walking in. They're unarmed. What should Jefferson Davis, the president of Confederate States of America, do? Actually, he chose to set fire or open fire on the fort. Of course, the fort surrendered. The South was rejoicing that they defeated or captured that fort. It was a small victory, but the fort was lost, but the Union was saved. What does that mean? Meaning that it was a tactical victory because now the North saved face. That it was the South who started this war. They attacked their way through. We didn't do anything. So they are the ones causing the whole trouble here. All right. So Lincoln automatically now has justification to now call 75,000 militiamen. Okay. 75,000 militiamen to begin enrolling them, to begin training them. Okay. Now, when Fort Sumter started, it added more states, more of the other slave states who didn't join in, 4 of them: Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Okay. So now the number from 7 went to 11. So now the score is going up, that there's more people joining the South in this Confederacy. Now, there are 4 more slave states that had slaves, but they didn't join. We can call them the border states because they're right at the border between each other, like in the middle across the United States. And the middle states are Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, if you can imagine, and later West Virginia. If you can imagine that there are these states that are in between North and South, but then these slave states didn't join the South. They remained part of the North. Now, Virginia joined, right? Virginia joined the South, but what is this West Virginia? This is when West Virginia was born, because the West Virginians are the mountain people, the mountain whites, the ones that didn't have the best land. They were very poor white people. So they were against the high, rich class whites of the South. So that's why they said, we're not going to join them. So these border states, actually, they were important. They were vital because they had the manufacturing capacity to supply half of horses, mules, and weapons and ammunition. Whoever takes these 4, that could have been the deal breaker for the victory in this Civil War. The South didn't win the war. The North was able to remain. The North kept Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, those places. So thankfully, these middle states didn't join in. They're slave states, so you would think they should join in the secession, but they didn't. The border states, in a sense, were loyal. And an anti-slavery war was extremely unpopular. Now, Lincoln didn't say that this is a war against slavery. If he did that, the border states would have left, saying, hey, we have slaves, and you're saying this is a war to free our slaves, so forget that. No, Lincoln said the main purpose is to save the Union at all costs. That's the main point, is to save the United States and put them together. We don't want to go against them. That's not our goal. Okay. Even the Indian Territory, they even sided with the Confederacy. Okay. And the Confederate government said, we agreed to give you federal payments, and invited the Native Americans as delegates to the Congress. So they used the Native Americans to make sure that they would join the South. The mountain whites of the South sent north 50,000 men. The loyal slave states contributed 300,000 soldiers to the Union. Okay, so the border states, they were still sending a lot of soldiers to the Union, but some of these people in the South still went in and joined the Confederates, 50,000 of them. The balance of forces. So what is the strengths and weaknesses in the Civil War? The Confederacy just had to fight a defensive war, meaning they just have to get their positions and maintain. They don't have to go up to the North and try to take it. They're not trying to take the North. They left it. So there's no reason for them to maintain joining the United States. They want to just be left alone. That was the goal. So just protect the Southern land. And they had the best generals. Remember, West Point is in the South. Robert E. Lee is there. He leads all of the generals, even Stonewall Jackson. He was a professor for the generals. So they had all of them, the best leaders. They were accustomed to managing horses, bearing arms from boyhood. They made excellent cavalrymen and foot soldiers. So they were used to fighting the Southerners. So that's why, even though it may seem like they're outnumbered, but they could fight 3 people and still win, like in terms of their skill and talent. Okay, but they lacked resources, which was going to be the pinnacle thing of the war. So the Southerners managed to obtain sufficient weaponry, but They were short of shoes, uniforms, and blankets. This is what was lacking in the South. Okay. Here is the North. The North had technology. Look at all these. Look at these cannons. They shoot very far. Very heavy cannons, and they can shoot very far, long distance. I don't know how they can even carry that over. Okay. The North had good transportation to move things down south. The South didn't have good transportation. Okay. The North was able to block the sea because they had the laborers. So if we can do the math here, you can see New England is, Massachusetts, Vermont, and those places, Connecticut, New Hampshire. They have 20,000 number of establishments manufacturing. Middle states, the border states, 53. So the border states made a lot of money. Western states, how about the southern states? They were very poor, right? Didn't have much capital to go against. So that's why the middle states were very important to not lose. 42% of the value was that. If this split in half 2020, or they took it, if the southern states took it, it would have been a balanced fight. It would have been really fair. And the South might have won. Okay. The lower states had a population of 22 million. The seceding states had 9 million people. So those are the numbers. Okay. Now, by this time, immigrants who immigrated were already caught up in a war to join it. A lot of them joined the Union to get the job. Dethroning King Cotton. Now, how do we make sure King Cotton doesn't become any more rich? Because if they have money, they can pay for soldiers, right? Well, they have to block their ports so they don't get to trade with the outside European world, especially Britain and France. Now, thankfully, because of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the people of Britain and France forced their government to not publicly support the South, even though the government wanted to support the South because it made money for themselves. So Uncle Tom helped Uncle Sam by restraining the British and French ironclads from piercing the Union blockade. Britain and France wanted to help the South, even though slavery is obviously wrong, but Britain and France, because of money, wanted to help the South. 75% of their cotton supplies, that's how much they depended on it. The British textile mills depended 75%. So why did King Cotton fail? He failed in part because he had been so lavishly productive in the immediate pre-war years of 1857, 1860. Enormous exports of cotton in those years had piled up surpluses in British warehouses. So there was a lot of surplus, a lot of leftovers. The British suffered a series of bad harvests. So they needed to get a lot of grain, a lot of food. Okay, the Trent Affair. So here is the decisiveness of diplomacy. There was a ship called, a British mail steamer, the Trent, and it removed 2 Confederate diplomats. It was bound for Europe. Now, what happened is they caught this ship. And if they knew that these Confederates were going to make deals with the British, so the British were meaning the Confederate ambassadors, they were having negotiations. And they were going to build more ships for the South. Actually, the British were secretly building ships for the South. These vessels were not warships with the meaning of loophole British law because they left their shipyards and picked up their guns elsewhere. Britain was thus the chief naval base of the Confederacy. The Alabama led the skies from Europe to the Far East with the burning hulks of Yankee merchantmen. Charles Francis Adams. Okay, so this is the minister who discussed that, and then they said, okay, they got caught, and London had to remain neutral. That was the deal. Glowing Northerners looked farther north and talked openly of securing revenge by grabbing Canada when the war was over. But there were some businesses. John Laird and Sons shipyard was making ships for the South. They were hiding it. And Minister Adams said, hey, this is war. If you guys release those ships, then if it goes to the South, then this is war against America. So they would go to war. And where would that fight be? In Canada. That's where the British are at. So what did Parliament do to make sure that, what did England do to make sure that they don't get involved in the Civil War? Parliament established the Dominion of Canada, which is almost like giving them independence so that they can say, hey, this is not our fault. This is the Canadians making this deal. Okay. And then while America's busy with their Civil War, the Archduke Maximilian of Mexico. Now, what happened is the French set up a government in Mexico while America's busy turning their back. So they thought that they could take advantage of Mexico. Now, what does that mean to America? Well, Mexico is America's #1 customer in a sense. It's just right there. They make a lot of money from them. So Secretary of State Seward said they are going to send military down to Mexico against the French if you don't remove those people. Okay, so it's very serious stuff. So then the Mexicans rebelled against the Europeans, tried to take over Mexico, and the Mexicans killed Maximilian. All right, President Davis versus President Lincoln. So what is the difference between these two guys? Now, what is the reason for the South? Well, states' rights, right? A state's rights. But here's, this kind of meaning and motivation to fight the war was actually working against the South, working against Jefferson Davis, because Georgia didn't want to do certain things with the South. They had their own way of fighting the Civil War. So then when Jefferson Davis said, hey, do this, do that, Georgia says, hey, states' rights. We have the right to not follow you. And so this was just like, the states' rights worked against them. Okay, it was more damaging than helpful. Okay. Jefferson Davis was humorless, legalistic, stubborn. He was always, forcing people. So he wasn't like a Lincoln. Okay, he had devotion, but he couldn't keep the South together. It was very difficult. They all wanted to do their own things. Lincoln was different. He was tactful, quiet, patient, firm. He was a genius for interpreting and leading a fickle of public opinion. He knew how to keep the nation together, keep them in a sense jolly and motivated about the Civil War, and not to go against him. The more he could do that, the more people could sign up and support him. Okay, but Lincoln did have some things he kind of like was unconstitutional, broke the laws about. He boldly proclaimed the blockade. He increased the size of the army. He directed the Secretary of Treasury to advance $2 million without appropriation or getting it approved. He suspended the habeas corpus, meaning that if you were supporting the war, if you were for the South, you could go to jail, even though you had the freedom of speech. Okay, he supervised the voting in border states to make sure that people wouldn't be voting for the South or supporting the South in any way. So he did kind of like bend the laws here in this section right here. Okay, volunteers and draftees, North and South. So there was a draft, but the rich guys didn't get to join it, like John D. Rockefeller. They sent people in their place to fight, and they're trying to make Irish people join the military, but the Irish people didn't want to join too. There was a lot of Irish Americans who shouted down with Lincoln, down with the draft. They didn't want to support the war. More than 90% of the Union troops were volunteers. Okay, and there are some people who were bounty brokers, substitute brokers, meaning they pretended to sign up, took the money, and then they ran away. They said, sure, I'll see you at the training tomorrow. Pay me now. I'll be there. Okay, welcome to the military. They never show up the next day. They go to the next one and the next state and the next town, pretending they're enrolling, for the military, but they just wanted to take their money. Also, there's people who also still deserted the military or left the military while they were in it. So this is what was going on. What about the age? Richmond had from 17 years old to 50 years old. Wow. Old people were even in the war. In the North, they didn't need to. Economic stresses of the war. The Morrill Tariff Act superseded the low tariff, existing duties to 50 to 10%. Okay, to provide more protection for the process manufacturers who were being plucked by the new internal taxes. Okay, so a protective tariff. Okay, it now increased. Okay, they needed to do that, and they had money, so they printed out greenbacks. Okay, and they basically borrowed money from the people to pay them back at a later date, which is going to be a problem later. We'll talk about how that becomes a problem later. The North's economic boom, okay, because of military wear, uniforms, money is being grown, and because people needed to eat, grain is being grown, a lot of food for the soldiers, oil is being found. At the same time, there's this oil rush in a sense, so it was used for the military, and a lot of women started to work. So this is the social changes happening in America. 400 women accompanying their husbands or sweethearts and proposing as male soldiers, okay? And they also created a nursing U.S. Sanitary Commission here at this time. So we have it led by Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix, who make sure that the soldiers were clean. And the more that they were healthy and clean, then they could not get sick and continue fighting in the war. Some of them even helped to donate money, meaning they had some money drive to support the war. So they were able to crush the economy of the South this way because the South didn't know how to make money. It only depended on cotton, and there wasn't people buying it at that time. Okay. So at war's end, the northern captains of industry had conquered the southern lords of the manor. Now cotton capitalism had lost out to industrial capitalism. So would cotton win or industries win? Of course, the industries will win. Cotton is only a one product. So that this is translated economically because of the industries is going to help America in the war a lot. Okay, so that was chapter 19.